It started with a sentence that didn't make headlines, but should have. We have not used our real missiles. No explosion, no official declaration of escalation, just a quiet, almost calculated message, reportedly coming from within Iran's military circles, dropped into the noise of a war that has already stretched into day 57. And if that sentence is true, then everything you think you know about this conflict is wrong, because what you've been watching might not even be the real war yet. For nearly 2 months, the world has been locked into a slow burning confrontation between Iran and the United States. Naval movements, drone interceptions, oil routes under pressure, strategic warnings from both sides. On the surface, it looks like controlled escalation, almost contained, but beneath that surface, something doesn't add up. Because despite dozens of reported strikes, intercepted drones, and rising tensions across key regions, one question keeps resurfacing among military analysts. Why does it still feel like both sides are holding back? Think about it. The United States has deployed significant naval assets into critical waterways. Surveillance has intensified. Regional allies are on high alert. And Iran, they've responded, but not in the way many expected. No full scale missile barrage, no overwhelming show of force, no unmistakable point of no return. Instead, what we're seeing is precision, calculated moves, signals, almost like a message is being sent, but not directly. And now that message might finally be slipping through the cracks. Because if Iran is telling the truth, if they really have not used their real missiles, then what we've seen so far is only a fraction of their actual capability. And that raises a much darker possibility. What are they waiting for? To understand why this matters, you have to look at how modern conflicts are fought, not just with weapons, but with perception. Wars today aren't only about destruction, they're about timing, psychology, pressure. Every move is designed to send a signal. And sometimes the most dangerous signal is restraint, because restraint can mean one of two things. Either a side is trying to avoid escalation, or they're preparing for something much bigger. Over the past few weeks, there have been subtle but critical shifts. Satellite imagery has reportedly shown unusual activity at certain military sites, movements that don't match the scale of what's being used on the battlefield. Defense analysts have pointed out inconsistencies between Iran's known missile inventory and what's actually been deployed. Even more interesting, some of the weapons used so far appear to be older systems, limited range, lower payload. Not the kind of arsenal you bring out if you're trying to dominate a conflict. So again, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why hold back? There's a theory circulating quietly among strategic circles, a theory that suggests this entire phase of the war, these 57 days, might be something else entirely. A test, a probing phase, a way to observe, react, and map out the opponent's responses. Because every time a drone is launched, every time a ship moves, every time a defense system activates, data is collected, patterns are revealed, weak points are identified, and over time, a picture starts to form. Now imagine this. What if Iran isn't trying to win this phase of the conflict? What if they're trying to learn everything about how the US responds before they actually commit their strongest capabilities? Suddenly, that one sentence, "We have not used our real missiles," starts to sound less like a warning and more like a strategy. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because if this is true, then the US is likely aware of it. And that creates a dangerous loop. Each side watching the other, knowing the other is watching, both adjusting in real time. It's not just a conflict anymore, it's a chess match, played with live weapons. And in chess, the most dangerous moment isn't always the opening. It's the moment when one side sacrifices something small to set up something devastating later. So, what if the limited strikes, the controlled responses, the restraint, what if all of that is intentional? A setup, a positioning phase before something far more aggressive is unleashed. Because here's the reality no one is saying out loud: if Iran truly has more advanced missile systems, longer range, higher precision, greater destructive capability, and they haven't used them yet, then the balance we're seeing right now is not the real balance. It's temporary. And temporary balances can break fast. Now, add one more layer to this: timing. Why release a message like this now? Why day 57? Why not earlier? Why not later? Messages in war are never random, they're timed, placed. designed to reach the right ears at the right moment. So if this message is surfacing now, it might mean something is about to change because there are only a few reasons you tell your opponent you haven't used your full strength yet. One is to warn them, two is to intimidate them. But the third reason, that's the one that should worry everyone watching this. You say it right before you're about to prove it. And if that's the case, then the next phase of this conflict may not look anything like what we've seen so far, because up until now, this war has been controlled, measured, calculated. But the moment real missiles enter the picture, control becomes a lot harder to maintain. So the question isn't just what Iran has been holding back. The real question is what happens the moment they decide to stop holding back? And more importantly, what forces that decision? Because as we move deeper into this conflict, there are signs, small but growing, that the pressure is building on both sides, and pressure eventually needs release. The only question is how and when. But what most people missed over the last 72 hours is that something else changed, something quieter, something that didn't get the same attention, but might be even more important than that message: a movement, a repositioning, a shift that suggests this war might already be entering its next phase without anyone officially announcing it. And if that shift means what some analysts think it means, then that message about real missiles wasn't just a warning, it was a signal that something is already in motion. That shift we ended on, it didn't happen in front of cameras. There was no official statement, no breaking banner, no dramatic footage. But behind the scenes, across key regions tied to this conflict, something started to move. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with what analysts began quietly tracking over the last few days. Not explosions, not strikes, positioning. Because while headlines were focused on interceptions and warnings, military observers were looking at something else entirely: where assets were going, and more importantly, where they were no longer staying. In multiple areas connected to this conflict, patterns began to change. Naval routes adjusted slightly, not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to raise eyebrows. Surveillance paths shifted, and certain units, once typically kept further back, appeared to be moving closer to operational zones. At first glance, it looks routine. Rotations happen, assets move, that's normal. But here's the thing about military patterns: they only look random until you zoom out. Because when analysts zoomed out, a different picture started to form, a pattern that suggested coordination, preparation, and possibly anticipation. Now, connect this back to that message: we have not used our real missiles. If you were planning to introduce more advanced capabilities into a conflict, what would you do first? You wouldn't announce it. You'd adjust your environment. You'd reposition your defenses. You'd prepare for the response you know is coming. Because here's the reality: the moment more advanced missile systems enter the battlefield, the entire dynamic changes. Response times shrink, detection windows narrow, mistakes become far more costly, and escalation, it accelerates fast. So if Iran is preparing to shift into a new phase, they wouldn't just focus on offense, they'd prepare for what comes after: retaliation, countermeasures, containment. And that's exactly what some analysts believe these subtle movements could be pointing toward. But here's where things get even more complicated, because it's not just about what Iran might be preparing, it's about what the United States might have already detected. You see, in modern warfare, very little stays hidden for long. Signals are intercepted, movements are tracked, patterns are analyzed in real time. So if there is a shift happening, there's a strong chance the US already knows. And that creates a dangerous dynamic, because now both sides could be operating with the same understanding that the current phase of the conflict is ending, and the next phase could be far more unpredictable. This is where the idea of hidden signals becomes critical, because not everything in a conflict is meant for the public. Some messages are sent directly from one military to another, through actions, through positioning, through timing. For example, when a specific type of system is moved into a region, one that's designed to intercept high speed threats, that's not just a defensive action, it's a signal. It says, we're preparing for something faster, more advanced, more dangerous. And if both sides start making those kinds of moves at the same time, it suggests something even more serious. They're preparing for each other's next step. Now, pause for a moment, because this is where most people misunderstand what escalation actually looks like. They expect a sudden explosion, a dramatic turning point. But real escalation often happens quietly, piece by piece, move by move, until suddenly there's no way to de escalate without losing ground. And right now, we may be watching that exact process unfold because alongside these movements, there's been another shift, one that's even harder to detect, but just as important: language. Listen closely to how officials have been speaking over the past few days. Not the headlines, the wording, the tone, the phrasing. There's been a subtle change. Statements are becoming less about avoiding escalation and more about justifying potential actions. That might not sound like much, but in geopolitical terms, it's huge because before any major shift in conflict, there's usually a narrative shift first, a buildup, a framing of events, so that when something does happen, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It feels inevitable. And that's exactly what makes this moment so critical because when you combine a message about real missiles, subtle but strategic repositioning, signals of defensive preparation, and a shift in official language, you don't just get tension, you get alignment, alignment towards something, something that hasn't happened yet, but might be getting closer. Now, here's the twist that changes everything because there's another possibility, one that flips this entire situation on its head. What if the message about real missiles isn't just about capability? What if it's about deterrence? In other words, what if Iran is trying to stop something from happening by hinting at what they could do next? This is a classic strategy. You don't show your full strength, you suggest it. You let the other side imagine the worst case scenario. And sometimes that's enough to change their behavior. But deterrence only works if the other side believes you. And that's where things get dangerous. Because if the US believes the message, they might slow down, recalculate, hold back. But if they don't, if they see it as a bluff or a psychological tactic, then the opposite could happen. They could push forward even harder. And that's when miscalculation becomes a real risk because both sides could be interpreting the same signal in completely different ways. One side thinking, this is a warning, we should pause. The other thinking, this is a bluff, we should act. And in that gap between perception and reality, conflicts escalate fast. Now, add one more layer to this, because while all of this is happening between Iran and the United States, they're not the only ones watching. Regional players, allies, rival powers, everyone is analyzing the same signals, trying to predict what happens next, and in some cases, preparing to respond in their own way, which means this isn't just a two sided situation anymore. It's a network of reactions, a chain of decisions where one move can trigger another and another and another. So when you hear a statement like, we have not used our real missiles, it's not just a message to one country, it's a message to everyone involved. And depending on how each player interprets that message, the next phase of this conflict could unfold in very different ways. But here's the part that should really make you stop and think. Because while analysts are focused on movements, signals, and language, there's one question that hasn't been answered yet, a question that sits at the center of everything we've discussed so far. What exactly are these real missiles? What makes them different, more advanced, more precise, more destructive, or something else entirely? Because if the answer to that question is what some experts fear, then this isn't just about escalation anymore. It's about a shift in the entire nature of the conflict. And once that shift happens, there's no going back to the slow, controlled phase we've been watching. So, what are these real missiles? That's the question everything is now orbiting around. Because up until this point, we've been talking about signals, positioning, and strategy. But now we're stepping into something far more concrete: capability. And if the message is real, if Iran truly has been holding something back, then the difference between what we've seen and what could come next might be far bigger than most people realize. Let's break this down carefully. Because when analysts talk about real missiles, they're not just talking about bigger explosions, they're talking about a different class of weapon entirely. Think about the systems that have likely been used so far: shorter range, predictable trajectories, easier to detect, easier to intercept. These are weapons that send a message, but still operate within a certain level of control. Now, compare that to what could be sitting in reserve. We're talking about systems that move faster, fly lower, change direction mid flight, reduce detection time to seconds, and in some cases, don't follow the traditional rules of missile defense at all. And that's where things start to get dangerous because most modern defense systems are built around prediction. They track a launch, calculate a trajectory, position an intercept, neutralize the threat. But what happens when the trajectory isn't predictable? What happens when the window to react shrinks from minutes into seconds? Suddenly, defense becomes uncertainty, and uncertainty is where mistakes happen. Now, imagine that shift happening in a region already filled with tension, already filled with armed forces on high alert, already operating under pressure. This isn't just about more powerful weapons, it's about compressing time, because in a conflict, time is everything. Time to detect, time to decide, time to respond. If that time disappears, so does control. And that's why the idea of real missiles is so unsettling, because it suggests a move away from controlled escalation and towards something far harder to contain. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex because capability alone doesn't define how dangerous something is, intent does. So the real question isn't just what can these missiles do? It's when and why would they be used? There are a few scenarios analysts are quietly considering, and none of them are simple. Scenario 1, controlled escalation. Iran introduces more advanced systems, but in a limited, targeted way. A demonstration, a signal of capability, something designed to shift the balance without triggering full scale war. At first glance, this seems like the safest option, but even this carries risk because once those systems are used, even once the threshold changes, what was once hypothetical becomes real. And once something becomes real in a conflict, it can happen again. Scenario 2, forced response. Something triggers a reaction. An interception goes wrong. A strike hits something it wasn't supposed to. A line is crossed, intentionally or not. And in that moment, restraint disappears. Decisions are made quickly. Pressure overrides caution. And suddenly, those real missiles are no longer being held back. This is where escalation becomes unpredictable because it's no longer about strategy, it's about reaction. Scenario 3, preemptive use. And this is the one that concerns analysts the most. What if the message we heard wasn't just a warning? What if it was preparation? Because in some conflicts, there's a moment where one side believes if we don't act now, we lose the advantage. And when that moment comes, they don't wait, they act first. If Iran believes that its window to maintain strategic leverage is closing, then holding back those advanced systems might not make sense anymore. They might decide to use them not reactively, but proactively. And that's when the entire structure of the conflict shifts. Because preemptive use doesn't just escalate tension, it accelerates everything. Response times shrink, decisions become faster, and the space for diplomacy, it almost disappears. Now, here's where things get even more serious because no matter which scenario unfolds, the moment advanced missile systems enter the equation, other players are forced to respond, not just the United States, but regional allies, defense networks, strategic partners. Because once the nature of the threat changes, everyone has to adjust. And those adjustments don't happen in isolation, they ripple outward. A defensive system activates here, a countermeasure deploys there. An ally increases readiness somewhere else, and suddenly, what started as a two sided conflict begins to expand. This is how localized tensions become regional crises, and regional crises can spiral into something much larger. Now, pause for a second, because there's one detail we haven't fully explored yet, and it might be the most important piece of this entire puzzle. Why say it out loud? If Iran truly has these capabilities, why hint at them? Why let that message slip into the open? Because in warfare, information is a weapon, and sometimes what you say is just as important as what you do. By stating that they haven't used their real missiles, Iran achieves several things at once. They create uncertainty. They force their opponent to question what's coming next. They increase psychological pressure. But more importantly, they shift the conversation. Now, the focus isn't just on what's happening, it's on what could happen. And that changes how decisions are made because when uncertainty increases, caution can either rise or disappear completely. And that brings us to the most dangerous possibility of all. What if both sides are now operating under increased uncertainty at the same time? Because that's when even small actions can have massive consequences. A radar misinterpretation, a delayed signal, a misread movement, Under normal conditions, these things are manageable, but under pressure, with shortened response time and heightened expectations, they can trigger something much bigger. And once that chain reaction starts, it's incredibly hard to stop. So, as we reach this point in the conflict, day 57, we're no longer just watching a slow escalation, we're watching a system under pressure, a system where capability, intent, and perception are all colliding. And right at the center of it is that message: we have not used our real missiles. Because if that statement is true, then what comes next could redefine everything we've seen so far. But here's the final twist: because while everyone is focused on missiles, movements, and military strategy, there's another factor building quietly in the background, a factor that has the power to push this conflict over the edge without a single missile being launched. And once it comes into play, the situation may not just escalate, it could explode. There's a moment in every conflict, a moment that doesn't look dramatic on the surface, no explosions, no breaking alerts, but quietly shifts everything. A moment where pressure builds to a point that something has to give. And in this war, that pressure point isn't just military. It's not just about missiles. It's not even just about strategy. It's about the system surrounding the war. Because while the world has been watching ships move, drones get intercepted, and warnings fly back and forth, another force has been tightening in the background, slowly, relentlessly: economic pressure, energy routes, global stakes. Think about this. The regions tied to this conflict aren't just strategic for military reasons, they're critical for something far bigger: global energy flow, oil routes, shipping lanes, choke points that the world depends on every single day. And over the past 57 days, those routes haven't been fully disrupted, but they've been tested. Small incidents, near interceptions, tensions around key passageways, nothing catastrophic, but enough to send a signal. Because in modern conflicts, you don't always need to fire the biggest weapon to create impact. Sometimes you just need to threaten the system everyone relies on. And that's where this entire situation becomes far more dangerous than it appears. Because if military escalation reaches a certain level, it doesn't stay contained to the battlefield. It spills over into markets, into economies, into global stability. Now imagine this scenario: tensions spike, advanced systems are introduced, one miscalculation leads to a larger strike, and suddenly a critical shipping route is no longer safe, even temporarily. What happens next? Energy prices surge, markets react instantly, supply chains feel the shock, and countries that aren't even directly involved in the conflict start to feel the consequences. That's when pressure stops being local and becomes global. And once that happens, the stakes change completely, because now it's not just about Iran and the United States. It's about every country that depends on stability in that region, which means more players, more interests, more pressure to act. And here's the critical part most people miss: when global pressure increases, it doesn't always push toward de escalation. Sometimes it does the opposite, because each side knows that backing down now doesn't just affect the battlefield, it affects perception, power, credibility. And in geopolitics, credibility is everything. So instead of stepping back, both sides can feel pushed to stand firmer, respond stronger, signal even more clearly that they won't be the ones to fold. And that's how conflicts lock into place. Not because either side wants full escalation, but because the cost of backing down becomes too high. Now, bring this back to that message: we have not used our real missiles. At first, it sounded like a warning, then a signal, then a strategic hint. But now, in this context, it becomes something else entirely: leverage. Because in a system under pressure, leverage is power. By holding back advanced capabilities, Iran isn't just preserving strength, they're creating uncertainty. They're shaping how others respond. They're influencing decisions without even acting. But leverage only works for so long, because eventually one of two things happens: either the pressure eases or something forces a release. And right now, there are signs that the pressure is still building. We're seeing increased alert levels, more defensive positioning, more careful language, but also more justification for potential action. It's like watching a spring tighten: each move, each message, each shift in posture, adding tension. And the more tension builds, the harder it becomes to control what happens when it finally releases. Now, here's the final uncomfortable truth: conflicts like this don't always escalate because of a grand plan. They escalate because of timing, because of miscalculation, because of one moment where restraint fails. And when that moment comes, everything that's been held back, everything that's been signaled, everything that's been prepared can come into play all at once. That's why day 57 matters, not because of what has already happened, but because of what it represents: a prolonged phase of controlled tension, a buildup of signals, a quiet alignment of movements, all leading to a point where the next step is no longer predictable. Because once advanced capabilities enter the equation, once global pressure peaks, once both sides feel they can't step back, the nature of the conflict changes. It stops being a slow burn and becomes something far more volatile. So when you hear that message now, when you hear we have not used our real missiles, it's no longer just a statement, it's a question. How long until they do? And maybe more importantly, what happens the moment they do? Because that moment could define everything that comes next. And by the time the world fully realizes what's happening, it might already be too late to contain it. This isn't just a conflict anymore, it's a countdown shaped by pressure, perception, and decisions being made in real time. And right now, we're all watching it tick.